Last week we presented all the conflicting ideas of what consciousness really is. This week we're going to home in on what I personally think are the answers, but obviously I don't know for sure. Now it's worth actually giving a bit of information about what my background is, because I believe that the people that know the right answers are the ones that have had the most experience in the different areas. Because for consciousness, it involves philosophers, neuroscientists, physicists, and computer scientists to understand what is the nature of consciousness. My own background is I have a PhD in physics, but I then spent 30 years working in computing, and I think that mixture is very useful, particularly when it comes to knowing whether or not computers could ever emulate a brain and consciousness. Okay, what can we agree on what consciousness really is? I think in general we can say that it's about knowing oneself, understanding oneself, and making one's own decisions. Now, is there a difference between human-level artificial intelligence and consciousness? Now, this is where people differ in their views. As I explained last week, Daniel Dennett believes that there is no difference. In fact, he says that consciousness is just an illusion. It's something that we're fooling ourselves, and that when we do make artificial intelligence, those will or might even themselves think that they are conscious, and also appear to us as being conscious. And that is what I agree with, and we'll talk about that later a bit more. Now, is Ollie, my cat, conscious? And I think the answer to that is that there are levels of consciousness, and that my cat can understand certain things. He understands how to hunt animals. He understands even when I am slightly annoyed with him, to some extent, but not in total. But if Ollie sees himself on television or sees himself in the mirror, then he doesn't actually understand. He doesn't understand what that is. He hasn't got the concept of self, whereas some animals, like dogs, do understand those things a little bit more. So you can imagine that perhaps a worm has even a lower level of consciousness, but perhaps you could call something about what they do conscious, because they respond to their environment and adjust, and that is part of consciousness, but not the clever part. Now, last week I explained that the physicist Roger Penrose claimed that computers, being computational devices, could never emulate consciousness. Now, unfortunately, I totally disagree with this. He says he can prove mathematically that a computer cannot emulate consciousness. Now, the problem is that computers can do anything that you can describe. So if you describe some process, no matter how complicated or how difficult, then a computer can emulate or simulate that process. It could just follow the instructions. And this is why I don't believe his statements. To be fair to him, he believes that some of the processes going on come from quantum mechanics, and it's the physics of the quantum mechanics which is defining how consciousness works. Now, that is just a theory from him, and reality is, if you can describe even the quantum mechanics aspects, and say it's random or whatever, then those aspects could even be simulated themselves. It is true, though, that a simulation actually is slower and inefficient compared with the real process. So some people have put effort into creating hardware which is more like the brain. For example, IBM has some hardware called True North. This is a chip which actually has components physically equivalent to the neurons and its connections to other neurons. So this is very much similar to the way the brain works, and in it also, it doesn't even have a clock that that a normal CPU has. It's event driven, just like the brain. So this actually might be the answer to creating processing similar to a brain. But it doesn't mean that a normal processor or set of parallel processors, such as GPUs, could emulate that process in any case, all in software. And as chips get faster and faster, that also might be an option. And this is the belief of scientists like Ray Kurzweil, who have plotted the exponential rise in the price performance of CPUs over the last 30 or 40 years, and discovered that it keeps well to that law, and that by 2029 processors will be fast enough to fully emulate the brain. Let's take an example from David Chalmers, who's a philosopher, of how you can determine whether or not the brain is capable of being emulated by a computer. Now, what he said was, what you do is you go to the brain and you replace each neuron with a piece of silicon chip, one by one, and you look to, as you replace each one, whether or not consciousness is still there. And he does that until the final neuron is replaced by a silicon chip. That's 100 billion neurons, 100 billion silicon chips. And he still discovers that what he has is a conscious being, but an entirely artificial conscious being. And I think this is quite a sensible way of looking at it, and it shows that even though that might not be possible to do, it does show that emulation of a brain is entirely possible, and it will create consciousness. So let's just conclude where I think we've got to. In my opinion, consciousness is an illusion. It comes from an intelligent device or person. So as we create artificial intelligence, and as they get to human level intelligence, we will see that they appear to be conscious, and they even themselves think that they are conscious. So it is possible to create a conscious mind with a computer, and the hardware could be similar to the hardware we already have, or it could later on be different hardware which is more similar to the brain and therefore more efficient. But it is true that today's software isn't capable of creating all of the functionality of a brain or a general artificial intelligence. There are extra things that need to be created, and that is going to happen over the next few years. Today we have machine learning, and in future we'll increasingly have something called machine reasoning. This is a higher level than learning. It is creating concepts for the machine after it's learnt. And above that, above reasoning, there might be other conceptual ideas and a hierarchy of machine reasoning and learning. I do believe that the creation of a conscious artificial intelligence is going to show us how the brain works, much more so than a neuroscientist can understand it. But today's episode has created conceptual leaps from all the theories to specifics. Some of you might not actually agree with what I've said, so please comment below and increase the discussion on what you think consciousness really is. Anyway, that's it for this week. Next week I'll be going into more details of what the consequences of all this are and where it will all end up. So in the meantime, if you enjoyed this, please subscribe on YouTube, like in one of the places, and by all means comment. Many thanks. See you next week.